Everyone, this is the first of two videos, which is based around the mini lesson on the types of government. In order to organize your notes and ideas from this lesson, there's a graphic organizer provided in the Google Doc that is under the important resources where your other notes can be stored if you choose to type them. This has created a chart so that you don't have to write as much information down for the different types of government. This mini lesson, we are going to specifically focus on the first 5 types of government, which are based around people having a direct say in their government system. And then the second mini lesson, which will be in a separate video, is focusing on governments that have more of a centralized control system. Collectively, the two video lessons are covering two learning targets. The first one states I can identify and provide examples of different types of government. Within that learning target, we're specifically looking at the definition of the sovereignty, which is looking at who's in charge of, the power, which is talking about what people have the power to do or what a group has the power to do, the legitimacy, which is talking about basically how that government system was created, and the authority of them as to how they can enforce the laws, as well as an example of each of the types of government we're focusing on. The second learning target is specifically focusing on democracy, and it states I can compare, contrast, and evaluate models of representation in democratic governments. For that particular learning target, we are going to break the democracy portion of the lesson down into two and look at both a direct and a representative or indirect democracy. So, the first type government we're going to talk about is really not even a government at all, and that is an anarchy. By definition, an anarchy is a society without a central authority. In other words, it is a society which does not have a formal government system. Typically speaking, anarchies do not last long term because they lead to chaos, because there is no law, there is no order, and there is no one enforcing the rules. Within an anarchy, the power comes from the individuals because everyone is basically on their own. The power is decentralized and determined by community members. In other words, people that make up a community are deciding what's being done. This does not mean that they come together to form a government system. That would be a different type government, but rather that they are basically living their lives in different ways. The legitimacy of an anarchy comes from voluntary participation in a society. In other words, people who live in an anarchy are agreeing to live in a society that doesn't have government and agreeing to the potential of creating chaos in that society because there is no government system. Within an anarchy, the authority is equal and shared in responsibility of people basically doing what they think is best. There are very few examples of true anarchies, and typically they do not last long term. However, one historical example is the Free Territory of the Ukraine during the Russian Civil War. During this period of time, communities operated independently, and the peasants organized self defense under what was known as the Black Army, which defended against the Bolshevik Red Army and the White Army during the Civil War. The next type government we're going to focus on is a socialist based government. In some ways, a socialist based government may sound somewhat similar to anarchy because individuals share a lot of responsibility in the government system. However, in a socialist based government system, there still is a government and there are government leaders. By definition, socialism aims to achieve economic equality and social justice. Unlike a lot of the other types of government, it is specifically a system that is focused around the economy in terms of who owns what within the economy. The sovereignty comes from the government, which helps to organize and control things in order to provide or to eliminate chaos. The power comes from the support of the people who are willing to live in this type society, and this is mainly because people share ownership, especially of natural resources. So it is a different type mindset, and in a true socialist-based economy and government, people basically share all resources and means of production. The legitimacy comes from people wanting to commit to a free and equitable society. Typically speaking, socialist based societies lead to chaos because there's no one to provide for the different resources that the government's trying to provide for everyone. However, there have been various examples in history where different societies have attempted. So the authority comes from this promise of equality from the government system. An example of a pseudo-socialist-based government is Cuba. In Cuba, the state provides healthcare, education, and social service to citizens, as well as has some collective ownership. The next type government we're going to focus on is broken down into two subcategories, and that is democracy. Democracy is probably the type government you're most familiar with out of the mini lesson today. However, a democracy can be broken down into two categories. There's a direct democracy or a representative democracy. By definition, a direct democracy is a society where citizens have the power to directly make decisions. In theory, it sounds great because all individuals within that society have a say in the laws that are created, how laws are enforced, what the government looks like, etc. However, in practice, direct democracies rarely work because it can be very chaotic to get all the citizens in the society together. It can be problematic to force people to be a part of that government system. You may have people who don't really understand the government system involved, and it can halt all other society when people are getting together to deal with the government all the time and not able to carry out their other responsibilities. In practice, direct democracies typically only work in small societies, and even then, they can be problematic. In a direct democracy, the sovereignty or the power comes from the individuals that make up that civilization or society. The power is distributed equally among the people, so there's no ultimate person in charge, which can also become problematic when you have all the citizens in a society coming together and there is no ultimate leader in charge of them. The legitimacy comes from the collectivity of the citizens. In other words, all people are agreeing that this is the type government they want to have, and no one is trying to overthrow the other people to become more powerful. The authority within a direct democracy comes from the consent of the governed because, again, you are agreeing to a society where people are not able to overthrow the government. A historical example of a direct democracy would be Athens. However, in Athens, which was a great city state, they soon figured out that this is not the best form of government because of some of the issues I previously listed. One of the closest examples to a modern day direct democracy is Switzerland, because in Switzerland, the individuals that make up the country vote on a lot of referendums who help control the law. In a representative democracies, citizens elect representatives to make decisions on their behalf. The sovereignty comes from the consent of the governed because people are agreeing to allow these individuals to make up the government system. The power comes from the people because the people have the ability to vote for representatives who they feel would best represent their needs, and most government positions are revoted on every 4 or 6 years, which allows them to change their mind if they're not happy with how things are being run. The legitimacy within a representative democracy comes from free and fair elections, which are intended to basically put the person best for the job into the position. And the authority comes from the chosen will of the majority. So the most people within the specific location that that person is representing are voting for that person. An example of a representative democracy would be the United States. It, however, is the most common form of government, so there's a lot of other examples out there. Within the United States, individuals vote for the president indirectly, which we'll learn about more in a future lesson, for senators and the House of Representatives, as well as various other local and state representatives. The last kind of government we're going to focus on today is not typically referenced as a type of government, but rather basically a category of governments, and that is tribal governments. So, by definition, tribal governments hold authority over individual tribes. This is talking about tribes such as Native Americans that are found throughout the United States. Within a tribal government, and the sovereignty comes from the tribe having the ability to govern their own land and people. The sovereignty can look different depending on the tribe. So, not all tribal governments are run the same way. So, it's important to emphasize that even though we're talking about tribal governments separately, a tribal government can have a democracy or a different form of government that it is based off of. In fact, a lot of tribal governments are either related to direct or representative democracies. The power of a tribal government is that the tribe can choose how to create laws, enforce regulations, and manage the resources within their tribal land. The legitimacy comes from the tribal citizens agreeing to follow the government, as well as federal recognition. We'll talk about in future lessons how the federal government of the United States and Native American governments have had a difficult relationship over time in terms of if they can trust one another, and the US government basically overly controlling tribes without them necessarily even realizing it. So there are different statutes put in place, both within the Constitution and in various treaties, that are basically legitimizing the tribal governments. The authority is tribe dependent. So, like I said, all tribal governments are different. An example of one of the most discussed is the Navajo Nation, which is found in the United States. Within the Navajo Nation, as well as several other Native American tribes, they have their own judicial system and they oversee individual services such as education, healthcare, and infrastructure. So, in the next video, we will cover the remainder of the government systems, but those are talking about government systems where the government has more control. As you can see throughout this mini lesson, we're specifically focusing on governments that people have a lot of say in.